to Dr. Yaqub Bangash for doing a great job in bringing to us this excellent series of speakers over the past few weeks since the first virtual festival began. This is the fourth in the series. I have a very tough job today, given the hype this talk has gained on Pakistani Twitter. I have to introduce a world-renowned historian, Professor Neil Ferguson, who otherwise needs no introduction if you are interested in history in general. So let's begin with the easiest part. Professor Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He's also visiting professor at Tsinghua University, Beijing. Neil is the author of 15 books, some of them controversial for their arguments, especially if you carry the colonial baggage, like we all do in the subcontinent by default. You don't need to be a leftist in Pakistan to shred to pieces the idea of white man's burden, or some of the neo-imperialistic ideas that the Western civilization was God's gift to humanity, and how it bore the cross of modernizing civilization throughout history. And you don't need to fall anywhere on the ideological spectrum to protest against the armed interventions around the world supported by the neocons. You just need to have lived in Pakistan to have witnessed how neocons failed in almost everything they attempted, starting from the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 in our neighborhood, leading to this point in time where Taliban are now recognized as a reality by President Ghani and President Trump. We have seen the disastrous invasion of Iraq on the pretext of finding the WMDs Iraq never possessed. We have witnessed the devastating democratization experiments in Syria and Libya. Next, the temptations of poking Iran without understanding the culture or civilization of the country will again be the biggest folly by the US if it ever comes to that. You just need to have lived in Pakistan to know how even after 72 years since independence, day in and day out, we continue to fight the colonial mentality, the elitist and the feudal mindset at every step. Perhaps Neil should be given temporary residency in Pakistan to experience some of what he's written is not so much of is a gift for our country or our region, but a curse. So I can understand as to how some of what Neil brings to the table through his works like The Empire or The Civilization, The West and the Rest would make us feel uncomfortable or even emotional. But that's the purpose of debate. That's what academics do. They engage, they respect different viewpoints enough to have the tolerance to listen to those with opposing views. Having said that, Neil has written so much more that I've thoroughly enjoyed, like Neil's biography of Kissinger and his book on First World War titled The Pity of War, in which he has blamed England's entry into the war to be responsible for turning a continental conflict into a world war. If you're into economic and financial history, then look up Neil's excellent introduction to the House of Rothschild, The Ascent of Money, or The Cash Nexus, besides so many of his other works. However, today Neil's introduction to this audience will be through a book he published in 2018, The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook, which is a great read. The beauty of this book is that it is so utterly readable that you can start from any of the 60 short chapters and you won't need to worry about missing the context before or after. So welcome to the ThinkFest, Neil. As I started reading the book, I noticed that the title itself is not hierarchical. The square comes before the tower. So please do tell us as to why that happens. I would give you 12 to 15 minutes to introduce the thesis of your book. What is the square? What is the tower? The relationship between the two? And how have you brought in network science to understand the power and network nexus? And then I'll bring COVID-19 in my next question. So over to you, Neil.
Well, thank you, Rabia, for that introduction. And I'm glad you brought up some of the criticism of my work that there's been on social media. My impression of most Twitter commentary on books is that it comes from people who haven't read the books in question. And I'd urge anyone who feels strongly on questions of empire and indeed civilization to read the books with those titles, rather than to make their minds up on the basis of tweets. For example, in the book Empire, the second chapter about European and specifically British Colonization has the title White Plague, which I don't think is redolent of neocolonialist triumphalism. As for the book I wrote about American empire, Colossus, published back around the time of the invasion of Iraq, if you read that book, you'll see that it's actually extremely skeptical about the ambitions of the neoconservatives and predicts that the project of American empire in Afghanistan and Iraq will fail. And indeed it has failed for pretty much the reasons that I spelt out in that book. So I'm somewhat skeptical of much that gets written about me on social media, because nearly always the critics betray an ignorance of the books I've written, and perhaps they've read a review by Pankaj Mishra, but that's one of the most defamatory reviews anybody has ever written of one of my books, which completely misrepresents the argument of the book Civilization. At any event, let's turn to the most recent book, The Square and the Tower, which, as you say, has a significant ordering in its title. It's a book about networks, the kinds of social networks that you'll typically find in a town square, and about hierarchies, the more structured forms of organization, such as states or corporations, or of course empires, that you'll more likely find headquartered in a tower. And the argument of the book is that we can understand most of history, including the history of empires, with this framework. On one side, let's just take the example of the British Empire. A great deal that happened really from the 16th century onwards was not centrally organized, but actually grew out of networks of merchants as well as settlers, not forgetting missionaries. And these were really quite decentralized and not very hierarchical movements that led people from the British Isles to settle, work, trade, and of course engage in violence all over the world. The hierarchical part of the story really comes along somewhat later as governments based in London, but also in Calcutta and later Delhi, try to impose some structure on these rather spontaneous and relatively decentralized networks. So that's the key framework. And I think it helps us to understand our own time to use this framework. A key point the book makes is that there's been a transformation of the public sphere with the advent of the internet, as extraordinary as the transformation of the public sphere that happened in Europe with the rise of the printing press. And I think there's a lot we can learn from studying the 16th and 17th century about our own time. When you have a revolution in communications technology as extraordinary as the one we're living through, it has the effect of empowering networks, because suddenly everybody is in a position to be a journalist, even to be a video journalist with their smartphone. Everybody can comment, and the network platforms that have arisen, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, can impose some structure on this vast flow of data, but they can't really control the network in the way that in the old days, central ministries could control radio and television and cinema. So I think that's the key thing that makes our time different from, say, the 20th century, when the central control of communications was pretty easy. In order to make time for discussion, and we don't have nearly enough, I'll just say a few final words about how the framework of the Square and the Tower helps us to understand the pandemic that we're living through. COVID-19 is a perfect illustration of a recurrent theme of the book, that to understand contagion, you have to understand two things. The virus, the thing that's going viral, whether it's a biological virus or a meme online, and the structure of the social network that it attacks. And you can't really understand a contagion without knowing both those things. What we've discovered in 2020 is that we had built, primarily through the extraordinary amount of air traffic that now goes on, the perfect machine for spreading a new pathogen globally. And this happened with astonishing speed from its initial outbreak in Wuhan in China, probably November or December. to the point that we now have an entirely global contagion. And although it's been slow to spread in South Asia, anybody who looks at the trend lines of cases in Pakistan and India will see that the worst is far from over. Indeed, the pandemic is probably not even at the end of its first quarter, to use the terminology of American football. It's perhaps the first day of the test match, if you prefer cricket, as I suspect most people listening in do. So I think we are in the midst of a classic network-driven phenomenon. And I'll say just one more thing and then we can open it up. There are really two pandemics going on at the moment. One of them is the familiar one, spread by a virus that causes a disease. But there's another pandemic which is happening online, and that's the pandemic of misinformation and disinformation about the nature of the virus and the disease, which is causing an extraordinary amount of confusion as conspiracy theories flourish in the kind of networks that have already established themselves on issues such as vaccination, or for that matter, the political ideologies, whether racial or religious in nature, that are so very, very potent online. And so for the public, for ordinary people, it's an extraordinarily difficult time because you are being bombarded not only by a potentially lethal virus, but also by all kinds of confusing information about the nature of that virus. I found writing The Square in the Tower an incredibly exciting experience because I brought network science to bear on history, and I don't think anybody had done that before. And my basic view is that if you want to understand what's going on in the world today, you need to know some network science as well, of course, as some history. So this is a plug for my book, read The Square in the Tower, and when you're done, read Empire and read Civilization, not forgetting Colossus. And I'm going to guarantee that your view of Neil Ferguson will change.
Thank you so much for that context, Neil. I guess I would also urge everybody to read the books because without having read them, it's just so difficult to have debate. So given your own work, Neil, on the First World War and the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish flu that spread through global troops movements thereafter, talk to us about the present coronavirus, if it has any parallels with the Spanish flu, and if not, why not? We've seen the virus mutate and therefore it is attacking different regions differently. How are physical and social networks responsible for the spread of coronavirus? How much of it is attributed to globalization? There is a lot we don't know about the COVID-19 yet. So what are the right set of questions that we should be asking ourselves and our governments, especially in countries like Pakistan that are struggling economies? Over to you.
Well, Rabia, I guess I first encountered pandemics as an historical phenomenon writing The Pity of War. I was wading through statistics about the German army's performance in the crucial year of 1918 when it seemed to collapse, primarily under British attack after the Battle of Amiens. And I noticed to my surprise there was a great spike in the number of German soldiers reporting sick in the middle of 1918. And then the penny dropped as I was trying to work out what had happened, that this must be some sign that the influenza had arrived in the German army. To understand the 1918-19 pandemic, you need to understand first that there was a new strain of influenza to which almost nobody had resistance, that it seems first to have appeared in an American military base in Kansas, and troop movements, which were on a massive scale in 1918, rapidly spread this virus. You also need to know that the virus had the property that it attacked prime-aged people. And so it was actually the kind of age group that was being mobilized that was exceptionally vulnerable to the disease, very different in that sense from COVID-19. Now, this was a really catastrophic pandemic. It killed somewhere between 2 and 3% of the world's population, making it one of the top 10 pandemics in history. And we can learn an awful lot from studying what happened, particularly trying to understand why some countries were so much harder hit than others, or even why some cities were much harder hit than others. But before we draw too many lessons from 1919, let's remember that our pandemic is not as bad. And it's clearly, although dangerous and of course contagious, it's clearly a less dangerous virus than the influenza of 1918-19. On top of which, the world has much better medical science and much better healthcare than it had just over 100 years ago. And part of the problem with recent policy making is that if you go back to March, there was a period of panic when epidemiologists, including one unfortunately named Neil Ferguson, though he spells his first name differently from me, seemed to be saying that it was 1918-19, and if there weren't drastic measures taken, 500,000 people would die in Britain and 2.2 million people would die in the United States. And even at the time, I sensed that that must be wrong, because I couldn't see in the evidence that we had up until that point compelling evidence that we were facing a pathogen as dangerous as that of 1918-19. Remember, although SARS-CoV-2 is very contagious, it is not as lethal as the influenza of that period. We don't exactly know the infection fatality rate, but it's clearly going to come in significantly lower than for that influenza virus. So I think part of what's interesting about this is that I think people jumped to the wrong conclusion in March in thinking that we were facing as serious a threat to public health as people had faced in 1918-19. And I now think it's fairly obvious that that is not the case. This is not going to be a top 20 pandemic historically. It's actually going to come in, I think, closer to the 1957-58 pandemic, which most people have forgotten, even though it killed probably more than 1 million people around the world. And that's why historians can be helpful here, because we need to remind people that pandemics come in multiple sizes, and it's very unlikely at the moment that SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is going to be a top 20 pandemic. That means, I think, that some of the policy responses, particularly the lockdowns of economies that we've seen, have been overreactions that probably have caused more economic damage than they've achieved public health benefit.
All right, thank you. Well, that's, makes us feel better that, it's not right up there yet. And we hope that it doesn't make it to top 20 pandemics in history. So Neil, since you like counterfactuals, let me construct a counterfactual of the future for you. So stay with me through this. So the second wave of the pandemic has hit the globe in fall 2020, this time more severe than before. It will take a couple more years to recover from it. The death toll in the US is in the millions, and those who were reluctant to make comparisons with Spanish flu of the First World War are now rethinking those comparisons. Given how badly the US economy has been hit and its self-isolation from its allies, US is set to lose its influential leadership superpower status, and the world order is shaping to be truly bipolar, with US and China at the top. The G2 model has taken effect, accelerated by the pandemic. China has risen to the top, managed to contain the second wave of the virus, revived its economy at super speeds, and is helping the countries in its network of influence to do the same. We are in 2025, RMB is set to replace dollar, breaking its global hegemony, and the Western values have started to be replaced by the China model. In this backdrop, what networks need to come into motion to bring back the unipolar moment for the US again? Will the tower co-opt the square, or the square co-opt the tower to reverse the tide? Tell us your views on this what-if case scenario where the rise of the East and fall of the West has happened due to the pandemic. I know it's a huge counterfactual, but since you like to play with them, I thought I'll make one up for you.
Thanks, Rabia. It's a great question and an illustration of how we should think when we come to think about futures, because there's no one future. Even if there's one past, there are multiple futures that we are in a sense, trying to choose between. And so it's worth considering a kind of worst case scenario. You're absolutely right about a second wave. I always find it strange that the epidemiologists told us there was just one curve that we had to bend. All the pandemics in history that I've studied have multiple waves. 1918-19 did, 1957-58 did. And if you go back all the way to the Black Death, which is one of the worst two pandemics of all time, the bubonic plague just kept coming back for more. Not only in the Middle Ages, but again in the late 19th century, as historians of South Asia know only too well. So I think it's reasonable to suggest that there'll be a second wave. It's also reasonable to expect more mortality in the United States, which is currently engaged in what my colleague John Cochrane has called a dumb reopening. We're reopening the economy without having contained the contagion. But I think your counterfactual of a million American deaths is quite unlikely. At the moment, excess mortality is around about 100,000. And if you look at the daily data, the trend downwards nationwide is quite clear. There are second waves in multiple states, perhaps around a dozen, but the big economically important states around New York have clearly contained the pandemic, much as European countries have been able to do. I think there'll probably be somewhere like 250,000 deaths all told by the time this story is over in the United States, but it's not going to be much higher than that. And indeed, the question that you raised kind of implies some mutation that would make the virus more lethal than it currently is, whereas the tendency is for a virus like this to mutate in the other direction, to become less dangerous. Anyway, I like the counterfactual because I think you can get to a crisis of American power without a million deaths. You can get to it actually with fewer than 250,000, because so much is going wrong in the United States simultaneously. I've mentioned the second waves we're already seeing in the south and in the west of the country. We have an election coming up on November the 3rd that could be completely disastrous if the result is close. If it's a 2000 type result, you could have contested results in multiple states that would make the 2000 election look positively gentlemanly. Added to this, I think there's a general sense that American power under the Trump presidency has been misused in ways that have alienated even loyal allies of the United States. And so there is an opportunity of the sort that you described for China to take the initiative. And heaven knows the Chinese have been trying. Sure, this thing clearly originated in China, and they have some explaining to do about what happened in December and January. But they've tried their best, borrowing some techniques from the Russians, to push a narrative that actually it didn't originate in Wuhan. Indeed, it originated with an American sports team visiting Wuhan. And China, far from being to blame for this crisis, is in fact the savior of countries that are struggling. And China stands ready with ventilators, with masks, with loans. That's the narrative that Beijing is pushing pretty hard. And there are some receptive audiences for this narrative, I think, particularly in countries in Europe that were hard hit by the pandemic. So I think your counterfactual is not actually an unrealistic one. I think it's quite possible that we could see a crisis of American primacy, and it could happen quite soon. I'll go even further. I could imagine China and Russia trying to challenge the United States at this moment of weakness, perhaps over Taiwan, perhaps in other parts of the world, conceivably even we could see a challenge to American predominance in the Middle East. Heaven knows there's not much left of it at the moment, as the Russians seem to be able to intervene at will in Syria and now in Libya. So I see something going on here that can be traced back to my book Colossus, a fundamental crisis of American power, which was, remember, the central thesis of that book, that the US had three deficits. It had a manpower deficit because Americans don't really want to go to places like Afghanistan and Iraq. It had a fiscal deficit, which has only got worse since I wrote the book. And it had an attention deficit because in the end, Americans aren't that interested in trying to rule distant countries that are hotter and more dangerous than the United States. But let me give you an alternative scenario, because there are always multiple futures. I'll make it brief because time's short. Let's suppose that, in fact, Wuhan is to Xi Jinping what Chernobyl was to Mikhail Gorbachev, a sign of a profound pathology at the heart of the one-party state. And that while the rest of the world sees a still strong power, actually things are unraveling in quite a serious way within China. The growth targets have been abandoned. They're desperately re-legalizing street vendors to keep the unemployment rate down. The country is, in fact, I think, in a much more difficult position than certainly Western commentators appreciate. And while commentators like Kishore Mahbubani are predicting an Asian century, they're making the same mistake that people made in the 1980s. People like Paul Kennedy, who said the US is finished, it's going to be Japan, it's going to be West Germany. That turned out to be wrong. It was the Soviet Union that fell apart just a couple of years after Paul Kennedy published The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And I'm going to give you an alternative scenario that the crisis will actually be a Chinese crisis, a political crisis as well as a social and economic crisis. And the United States, which always looks as if it's in decline, always looks as if it's on the point of some kind of domestic breakdown, will turn itself around, just as it did after the rather turbulent 1970s. So those are the two futures, and I'm sure you and I could think of 3 or 4 more. The important thing is, let's think about the future or futures historically, trying to learn from past surprises. And let's remember how surprised everybody was in 1989, 91, when the Soviet Empire fell apart and then the Soviet Union fell apart, just a few years after the Chernobyl disaster.
Right, fair enough. Since we don't have too much of time to go back and forth on these two scenarios, but they surely are interesting, and I'm sure it will give our audience a lot to think about. So I will now take some audience questions. We have a lot of questions for you, so I hope I am able to go through most of them. And my apologies to the audience if I don't make it to all of them in the given time. So Neil, Oxford University's Oriel College has voted in favor of removing its statue of the Victorian imperialist Cecil Rhodes. With the worldwide protests against symbols of racism succeeding, isn't it time to recognize that these issues are no longer debatable and that people are rising up to get their voice heard? And to use your own terminology, can we say that the square has risen to take down the tower? What are the movement's broader implications that you see?
Well, I love that question because I've been publicly opposed to the removal of that statue of Cecil Rhodes, not because I think Cecil Rhodes was a wonderful man. I depict him in an extremely negative light in my book Empire, as anybody who's read it knows, but rather because I don't like iconoclasm. I don't, generally speaking, think that tearing down statues is a constructive activity. I prefer to see statues built. There's a wonderful sculptor in Scotland named Sandy Stoddart, who's responsible for 2 fantastic statues in Edinburgh today, one of David Hume, one of Adam Smith. And I'm with Sandy Stoddart. I heard him give a wonderful lecture a few years ago about the dangers of iconoclasm and how often in history, movements that tear down statues do more harm than good. We'll just remind ourselves, shall we, how many statues the Taliban destroyed during their reign in Afghanistan. So I'm instinctively hostile to the tearing down of statues, even statues of odious people. I like the building of statues, and I honestly think it would have been a far better step for Oxford to have erected, perhaps right next to Cecil Rhodes, a statue of some suitably alternative anti-colonial figure. I'm not going to suggest one because even Mahatma Gandhi has become a controversial figure in the post-colonial movement, which I think illustrates some of the strange paradoxes at the heart of that movement. In truth, we were really supposed to be having a debate about why the police use excessive force in the United States and whether or not they use excessive lethal force against African Americans. I have no idea why removing a statue of Cecil Rhodes is going to improve the situation with respect to police brutality in the United States. It seems to me rather like one of those upsurges of outrage that you see in times of plague. You got this in most of the great plague outbreaks of the past, in a time of uncertainty and fear caused by a new pathogen. People do strange things, and tearing down statues is sort of part of that process, where people let off steam and express their frustrations. But it's not to be confused with rational solutions to real social problems. And I do wish we could get back to a serious discussion of the problems that we confront. The most serious problem we confront right now is that we are in the midst of a pandemic and we have not worked out how to vaccinate against it, what kind of therapies might be effective against it. We have no idea when it's going to stop. This is the wrong time to be pulling down statues, folks. It's really not a particularly constructive activity. When the pandemic's over, let's discuss the statues we should build, and let's get back to the much healthier state of civilization when we construct rather than destroy.
All right, so there's a lot of symbolism involved here. This particular statue taking down of the statue has a history. You know, it's not related just to this rise of movement, the Black Lives Matter, but the timing has just coincided at this point in time. But fair enough, you know, you've given your 2 cents on it. I'll move to the next question. History strongly suggests that pandemics tend to widen the class and ethnic divisions. So COVID-19 is no exception to that. Comparing Donald Trump's online social network campaign of 2016 to that of 2020, and given how pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, have brought his ratings down, what is your super forecast for the elections in November? You make the argument that US should remain the world's dominant power, even a neocolonial power of sorts, but we are witnessing that US is incapable of such leadership because this pandemic has just brought those, the vulnerabilities to the fore. What are your views on it? Over to you, Neil.
Well, let me just be clear. I don't advocate American neocolonialism. As I said, the point about the book Colossus was to say that the project of an American empire would fail because the United States doesn't have the attributes to run an empire. But I do think that I'd prefer the United States to be the predominant power in the world as opposed to China, if that's the choice. Just as I preferred the United States when the choice was the Soviet Union, because I think there are very, very good reasons to be wary of a world in which the superpower is a one-party state, particularly a one-party state that has what amount to concentration camps for Muslim minorities, the Uyghurs and Xinjiang. So this is not the kind of superpower we should wish to embrace. The United States has many flaws, and one of the best features of the United States is that we have a free press where we can endlessly discuss those flaws, unlike in China. I think it's a really interesting moment in American politics because what I see is the commentators who got the 2016 election wrong setting about getting the 2020 election wrong in just the same ways. It's as if they've learnt nothing. I was in a spat with a Washington Post journalist a couple of weeks ago after I published my first column from Bloomberg Opinion, in which I said that the upsurge of Black Lives Matter would probably help Donald Trump politically because it had changed the subject from COVID-19, where he was on a hiding to nothing. And the journalists sneered that Trump's approval rating was so badly impacted that I was going to be immediately proved wrong. I showed him the tweet that he'd published 4 years ago, in which he predicted that Trump would lose the 2016 election because of, you guessed it, his low approval rating. And actually his approval rating was lower throughout 2016 than it has been over the last 3.5 years. So let's not pin our hopes or fears on opinion polls and approval ratings, because they are and were a deeply misleading source of information about American politics. People lie. People do not say, yeah, I'm going to vote Donald Trump, because there's actually a stigma associated with that now. You'll find yourself getting hated on, not least on Twitter. So I think we have to be very skeptical about what Americans are telling pollsters. Sure, there's been a great surge of Americans saying they agree with Black Lives Matter. There's also been a great surge of Americans buying firearms. Purchases of firearms in 2020 have soared across the country, and it's extraordinary. In March, for example, monthly purchases or background checks that are associated with gun purchases were double the level of the monthly average of 2019. I believe in revealed preferences as opposed to stated preferences. And I see revealed preferences that Americans are worried about law and order and social stability. And that is a very strong predictor of Republican voting. In 2016, one of the surest predictors of how you would vote was gun ownership. Households that owned guns voted Republican, households that didn't voted Democrat. So I don't think we should be jumping to the conclusion that Trump is done, even although it's very clear that he has a huge mountain to climb. The economy is in the tank. That's a problem for any incumbent. There's a perception that he screwed up on COVID-19, which I think he did. All of this is going against him, particularly in key swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. He's got to be, at this point, the underdog, but he was the underdog in 2016. And sometimes for somebody like Trump, the outsider, it helps to be the underdog. Finally, he's up against a very weak candidate in Joe Biden, who's widely regarded as being over the hill. I think if Donald Trump was facing a Barack Obama-like candidate, if the Democrats had been able to find a strong candidate who was young, dynamic, this would be over. But they've made a disastrous mistake by plumping for Biden, and in effect, the Obama-era restoration. That's kind of what a Biden presidency would be like. I don't think that's a particularly exciting prospect, least of all for all those young people who wanted Bernie Sanders to be the nominee and want a Green New Deal to be the top priority of the next administration. So we'll see. I think he's, as I said, Trump is the underdog, but Biden is not a strong favorite. And anybody who thinks they know the result on November 3rd, 4th in June, hasn't learned anything from the experience of 2016. Back in June, hardly anybody thought Trump had a shot. In fact, he was treated almost as a figure of fun in the liberal media in the summer of 2016. I can well remember the sneering conversations on Martha's Vineyard. I wrote in a column just before the election that Trump had a chance, a pretty good chance, as good a chance as the Chicago Cubs had of winning the World Series, and they did win it that year. So I think I'll just hold back from overconfident predictions. I think it'll be close, and the big worry is that it's so close, as I said already, that you get a tie and then a period of total chaos, litigation, confusion. That's the thing I worry about, not a Biden landslide.
All right. Yeah, I would tend to agree. Trump is full of surprises, and so are American people, and you never know. We might see a second Trump term, in November. So yeah, thank you for that response. We move on to the next audience question. We saw some backlash from the left in Pakistan against your appearance, and we have seen some against Harold Ulick's tweets last week. Is left trying to hijack the debate and using COVID to somehow prove its ideology and agenda? Left in Pakistan has been using COVID as an evidence that capitalism or free market cannot work. And they came up with Cuba as an example of socialist country that is well prepared to fight such challenges. What would Hayek or Milton Friedman say to left these days? Doesn't the bad performance by many governments around the world, including US, give an evidence against central planning and that it cannot even work when it's needed the most? So what would you have to say about that?
Well, I'll try and channel my inner Milton Friedman. I think Friedman would say, first of all, this thing originates in a communist country. That's not accidental. It was the Communist Party of China that hushed up the outbreak when it happened, told the doctors not to go public with evidence of human-to-human transmission. As I said, it's a Chernobyl-like illustration of what goes wrong in one-party states where there is no freedom of the press and where people can be silenced by party officials. So that's point one. Point two, the countries that have handled this best have been not only democracies, but free market countries. Take Taiwan, for example. Taiwan probably gets the highest grade for its COVID-19 response. There have been a tiny number of fatalities there, despite its proximity to China. South Korea also did a great deal better than, let's say, North Korea, where God knows how many people have died. South Korea gets a very high grade for its response. And both these countries did something that we're signally failing to do in the US, which is to use very rapid and widespread testing, combined with contact tracing through technology to make sure that super spreader events were quickly identified and potentially infected people tested and, if necessary, quarantined. So we know what works against COVID-19, and we know that actually harnessing technology, which, let me just remind you, capitalism came up with, because I can assure you the internet was not an invention of the left. You can use technology in ways that really do limit the spread of the disease very effectively. And the countries that have done best, by and large, are the countries that quickly adopted social distancing at the level of ordinary citizens, mask wearing too, and then used testing and contact tracing to play the game of whack-a-mole with the virus. I'll say one final thing in praise of capitalism. We're all waiting and hoping for a vaccine because that would certainly reduce the excess mortality due to COVID-19. Well, where is that likely to come from? Right now, there are more than 100 vaccine projects. The front runners include a company called Moderna, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the great majority of vaccine projects are either in North America or in Europe. There are some Chinese projects. The Chinese are desperately keen to try to come up with a vaccine. Frankly, China's record on vaccines is a pretty dire one, and it makes me very, very skeptical that China will be the winner in this contest. But you know what's great about this? What we see is competition in action. There's a tremendous competition on here to find a solution to this problem. It's going on when it comes to therapies. Companies like Gilead trying to find drugs that work. Trust me, Cuba is not your solution to a problem on this scale. The solution is that extraordinary combination of scientific research and competition and capitalist competition that has ultimately driven progress forward, not least in the realm of medical science, for the last several centuries.
Well, thank you for that. This gives me a good segue to the next question. Given your interest in money, having produced the documentary Ascent of Money, what is your position on how policymakers around the world may address the economic crisis in the wake of COVID-19? Are we going to have to return to Keynes' world where fiscal policy will rule the roost? And what are your views about modern monetary theory? Over to you for that, Nate.
Well, in a sense, Keynes has already won because the policy response in most developed economies has been to run enormous fiscal deficits. But Milton Friedman's also won because the response has been to do everything to avoid monetary contraction. So the Federal Reserve and other central banks have massively expanded their balance sheets. You get M3 growth rates in double digits in the United States. So in a sense, it's a win for both of the great economists of the 20th century. And I think that can't be criticized because in an emergency, whether it's a war or a natural disaster, the government needs to offset the contraction of private demand. And I think that's the appropriate short-run response. So the question is, what happens next? Because we started with relatively high public debt to GDP ratios in most of these countries. They're going to be at World War II levels by the time this is all over. And then we're going to confront some familiar dilemmas. Your choices are not very great if you have a very large stock of debt. You ideally want to grow so rapidly that in real terms, the debt to GDP ratio declines and you're able to run primary surpluses so that you're actually not being crushed by interest payments. But the number of countries in history that have been able to grow their way out of such large debt burdens in excess of 100% of GDP is pretty small. And what more often happens is either there's inflation and negative real interest rates, and the debt's reduced through that channel, which is pretty bad news for bondholders, or in countries that can't really go to the bond market. Think of Latin American countries like Argentina that were already in default when the crisis began. They're going to default some more, and you're going to see significant so-called haircuts for investors. That's what lies ahead. I think for a country like Pakistan, there's just much, much less room for maneuver than there is for the United States or any of the European countries, or for that matter, Japan. It's very difficult for an emerging market to crank up its deficit to double-digit percentages of GDP and expect the bond market to finance it. Of course, the Chinese have become the principal sources of external finance for emerging markets in the last few years, partly because of their One Belt, One Road initiative. But it's a very interesting question what's happening with China's lending to emerging markets. It's not at all transparent. In fact, it's very murky. But Carmen Reinhart, who recently took the job of chief economist at the World Bank, has been working on this. And I think what she's revealing is that the Chinese are not your favorite creditor in a crunch. And that negotiating with them when you are under intense pressure is a lot less fun than negotiating with the IMF or the World Bank.
I guess, yes, time will tell now that US, as a source of, lending money to various developing economies is going to dry up given their own internal usage of that money. Countries are looking towards China. So I think it's only a matter of time that we find out whether, what you say about China performing under pressure is going to work out or falter. We move on to the next question. I don't know if this is an audience question. Probably you mentioned somewhere in one of your blog posts or talks that academic life leads to cognitive blockage. How do networks help ideas get propagated and replicated? In your opinion, which important ideas have been stifled in history for lack of network structure, and how modern networks reduce the risk of inherently appealing ideas from being stifled?
Well, I don't remember saying that academic life caused intellectual blockage, though I can certainly see that it sometimes does. I've spent most of my adult life in universities, and I've been very fortunate because my job is to read books, think about them, sometimes teach students, and more often write books and articles based on what I've read and thought. So this is the opposite of intellectual blockage. The worst intellectual blockage is when you don't have time to read, and that's the common fate of most people in employment, whether it's at the bottom of the income distribution or at the top. Nobody seems to have enough time to read, or if they do have time, they spend it reading social media instead of books. And I am here speaking at this festival precisely to tell people, read books, don't read tweets. If you're spending time on social media when you could be reading the great authors of the past, you're getting it wrong. But I think the question's a good one. As I tried to show in The Square and the Tower, most of the great ideas or innovative ideas, let's say, in history have been spread through networks. It's not like it was a great idea that an emperor had that he then ordered to be communicated to everybody else. The Enlightenment, or even before it, the Scientific Revolution, or before it, the Reformation, all of these great ideological shifts that happened in the West were propelled by networks of scholars, not necessarily professors, because many of the great Enlightenment thinkers didn't have academic jobs. And all my favorite ideas, which I associate with the Enlightenment, the fundamental notions of individual freedom that you find in the work of, say, Adam Smith, originated in an amazing network of people spread all over the world who corresponded, wrote letters to one another, read one another's books, and one can graph that network. And part of the fun of doing The Square and the Tower was getting into the Enlightenment network and realizing that Voltaire's correspondence network is one of the things that transmits Voltairean ideas all the way around the world, including as far afield as Asia and across to the Americas. One of the tragedies of our time is that the core ideas of the Enlightenment, the basic notion of the individual as sovereign, of liberty as the ultimate goal, the critical importance of free thought, our ability to question religious dogma, which was central to the Enlightenment project. These ideas, which still are, to me, the core ideas for a free society and a good life, are really not doing well in our crazy world of internet memes and conspiracy theories. And I think one of the big challenges that people like me face, and I should perhaps also mention my wife, not a popular figure in Pakistan, but Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a great proponent of Enlightenment ideas. Our challenge is to make those ideas as exciting as the most clickbaity meme that you could encounter on Twitter. We've got to figure out ways of communicating the incredible appeal, the value of individual freedom through these new forms of communication technology. And I think, like classical liberals, whose ideas, I think, originate with thinkers like John Stuart Mill, we Enlightenment thinkers are not doing well in the so-called marketplace of ideas. And that's what worries me most, especially when I see that universities appear less and less hospitable to free thinking. It's an irony that you're actually more at risk from speaking your mind as a faculty member at a university these days than if you speak your mind in a local pub. That's a sad, sad commentary on what's happened in academia in my lifetime. Because back in the early 80s, when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, you could say whatever you liked, no matter how offensive it might be, if there was some intellectual substance to your argument. That's all gone, and we've been overwhelmed by the trigger warning safe space culture of the millennials and Generation Z. And it really makes universities a very boring, depressing place to function, and makes being in the classroom a lot less fun and certainly a lot less educational than it used to be.
Well, the fact that we are having this conversation and it's as free as it gets in Pakistan, despite the kind of hype that we have seen regarding this talk, there is hope. So one should have some hope. That's the best.
I couldn't agree more, Rabia. I think it's really, really great that we're able to have this conversation. That I'm hoping people are listening with open ears and open minds, and recognizing that this is really the heart of what a free society offers us. And you can't, at least it's getting harder and harder, have conversations as frank as this in China anymore. I've been a visiting professor at Tsinghua in Beijing for the last 5 years. And over that period, it has got more and more difficult to speak freely about issues of Chinese history. And that really is a great chill that begins to exert itself throughout Chinese universities these days. And some of my friends in Chinese academic life will privately tell you how depressing they find it. So it's very important for those people who live in unfree societies to see that we in the free world are doing our job right. And that means free speech. It means that on university campuses, there should be not just liberals and progressives, but also conservatives, that you shouldn't be run out of town or kicked off an editorial board because you dared to express some criticism of Black Lives Matter. I think this is really terribly important. I don't expect everybody to agree with me. In fact, I'd be quite worried if they all did. But I do expect to be able to speak freely, think freely, publish freely. And I hope that in debates about controversial subjects like the British Empire, we can have a serious debate in which we offer evidence on each side rather than simply descending into name calling. Because the most, I think, pernicious tendency that I see in intellectual life in my lifetime is that instead of having a debate about the evidence, the economic evidence, the social evidence, the cultural evidence, the political evidence, we no longer do that. What happens is that your good faith as an author is called into question. And people say, well, don't read his book. Don't you know that he's been completely discredited and is a dreadful neoconservative neocolonialist? This kind of thing is the enemy of serious intellectual inquiry. And I find it depressing that to this day, there's been so little serious engagement with the arguments that I made in Empire, which essentially were that there were costs and benefits to the British Empire, that one had to recognize both of these things, and one had to be able to discuss them and come to some conclusion about how the history of the world would have been in the absence of European imperialism. There's a counterfactual question embedded in every historical narrative. And you have ultimately to make the case that, for example, South Asian development would have been much, much better if the British had never turned up. You have to make that case if you really want to make the argument that on balance, the British Empire was a bad thing, that on net, it was a bad thing. And I've yet to see any really convincing make statement of that case. On the contrary, most of the great critics of colonialism just assume that absent European presence, things would have been much better. But that's not an assumption that stands up to close scrutiny, because there are places that did not have European intervention, and they did not develop more rapidly than the places that did. Anyway, I've said so many provocative things that I should probably shut up, but I feel strongly about this, and I'll say one of the great disappointments of my life has been the really lame debate that my book prompted, the lack of quality on the other side, and the resort to name-calling and questioning of good faith that stood in for serious scholarly engagement.
I'm all for debate, because unless and until you debate and dialogue, you just can't discredit or disregard, to be dismissive of other sides' arguments. So maybe we should get you in a virtual space with Pakistani colonial history professors, so that they can bring their sides. I'm not a colonial history expert, but probably there's so many in Pakistan who are. So probably it would be a good thing, for the next debates to happen, so that they can bring in their reservations about your work and, debate it out, because that's what all dialogue is about. With this, I'll just move to the last question, because I think we are out of time.
We are, I'm afraid.
Since COVID-19 has hit us, there's been a lot of chatter about de-globalization. How do you see the evolution of globalization, and especially its governing architecture, and its impact on economy, politics, and context of historical continuum? Is the global tower going to be challenged, and by which square in future?
Well, Rabi, I'll have to be very brief, because I'm supposed to be on another call right now. So let me put it this way. Globalization peaked in around 2007. It's been in retreat since then. Capital flows are down, our trade is down, even the sharing of digital intellectual property has been reduced. And so we see retreat really from 2008 with the financial crisis to today. And I think the pandemic has only exacerbated that trend. So my sense is that we'll look back and say that globalization overshot in the period from the 1990s, and that the downsides of globalization, the fact that so many people did not really partake in the benefits, was bound to bring about a backlash, not just a political backlash, but a fundamental backlash in the structure of the global economy. And I think that reset, that dialing back of globalization, is in many ways desirable. So I think we shouldn't mourn the decline of globalization, because I think if you look closely, we had hyper-globalization after around 2001. Admitting China to the World Trade Organization was probably a mistake in retrospect. And now we have an opportunity, the way the crisis creates opportunities, to rethink the structures of institutions that govern the global economy. There's a lot wrong with them. This is something I can agree with the left on. The key thing is not to destroy them altogether, which I think is President Trump's impulse. I would rather see a reset and a remodeling of the institutions of the global economy. And so on that optimistic note, where I even offer an olive branch to the left, I'm going to have to wrap, but I look forward to further discussions, Rabia, with you and with other intellectuals in Pakistan. One of the benefits of modern technology, including capitalist technology like Zoom, is that we can have these conversations without my needing to get on a long-haul flight all the way to Lahore.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. And stay safe.
Thanks to you, Rabia. Thanks to Yaqub for making this happen. And thanks to everybody for listening in. I hope you enjoyed it.
All right. Bye.